This is the 66th recording in the Kingdom Cassette Service Series, produced by the Federation of the Covenant People, P.O. Box 830 Honeydew, 2040, South Africa. This is the 11th part in our discussion on the law of liberty, and as our liberty, or otherwise, is dictated by the policies of the various governments within Anglo-Saxondom, I have entitled this recording, Who Should Rule in Israel? If we look at the nations whom we identify as the true modern development of Israel, which certainly does not include the Jews, we see that, notwithstanding a certain amount of local grumbling and dissatisfaction at the various pieces of legislation which takes its toll of what we perceive as our liberty, there appears to be a general acceptance of the structure by which we are governed. Now, this structure is, of course, the byproduct of what we call democracy, a system which purports to be the expression of the will of the majority as to who should administer the affairs of the country, always provided, of course, that the Constitution remains the inviolate machinery around which that administration takes place. Now, within the democratic system, we regularly elect our representatives on the basis of either promises of future performance in terms of the Constitution, or on their past allegiance to it. Or, in other words, we trust politicians to administer the machinery which reflects the image of our nation, an image which is seen by others who react either favorably or adversely to what they see. Now, having said this, take a look at the image which is projected onto the world scene by the various governments in Anglo-Saxondom. And I am sure that you will agree with me when I say that something has gone awry, and that our national image is no longer clear-cut and precise. It's become indistinct and featureless. It's become uncertain and distorted. And in this, I am not singling out anyone in particular. We are all in the same boat, and it's surely time that we started to ask some very serious questions. Now, I think that the first question which we should tackle is, what has happened to our concept of national dignity? And why are we allowing ourselves to be discouraged in our usage of the word nation? Have you noticed that for some time there has been a subtle change in the vocabulary used by our politicians, who have replaced the word nation with the word people? Now, I'm sure that you all recall Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg speech in 1863, when he spoke of this nation under God, an emphasis which is lacking in the modern speeches, where the phrase, the American nation, has been reduced to the American people, in much the same way as we hear people speaking of the British people and not the British nation. Now, what in point of fact is happening is that we're being told precisely the object of current politics, which in a nutshell is the obliteration of everything Anglo-Saxon. If we look at the word nation and the word people as these terms are defined in the dictionary, we can follow the political thinking in the minds of those who are supposed to represent us. And you know, the implications are not only ominous for us, but a distinct assault on what the Lord God said when he assured that the seed of Israel would be a nation before him forever. Now, in the first instance, we see that the English word nation is derived from the Latin natio, which Lewis and Short's Latin Dictionary defines as, and I quote, birth, a breed, stock, kind, or race. And if we look at the English dictionary, we see that in its primary meaning it is exactly the same, a distinct race characterized by common descent, language, or history. However, in its secondary meaning, it implies a people, irrespective of their origins, who consent to living together in a specific geographical area and under a single constitution. If we then turn to consider the word people, we see that this is a general term which only separates the human species from the animal kingdom. And within the human species, it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. You are simply called and lumped into the definition of that word, people. So then, the emphasis on the word people rather than nation tells us precisely what is happening, and that Anglo-Saxondom is no longer a separate, identifiable nation reflecting the image of our identity. We're becoming the byproduct of a racial amalgam which history has shown has been the downfall and the demise of the nations of antiquity. Now we must surely ask ourselves, how has this situation arisen, and who is responsible? Now, I don't think that there can be any doubt that our politicians must accept the major responsibility for this. After all, they are elected as the custodians of the nation, and honorable men should place the nation and its continuity as such above party or political considerations. Now, this accusation will no doubt be answered by the politicians, who will claim that they receive a mandate from the people at each election to continue with what they are doing, and therefore, if any blame is to be attached, it lies with the electorate. The electorate, my friends, in Anglo-Saxondom, in the main, we find that these people profess to be Christians, and as such are exhorted by Paul to submit themselves to the higher powers, who receive their authority to rule from God. Well, now, personally speaking, I cannot see that God would place his benediction on any institution or government which works to bring discredit to his holy name, nor would he authorize or sanction any legislation which nullified his integrity, as this is bound up with the seed of Israel being a nation before him forever. The current processes of transforming God's company of nations into a company of heterogeneous people does not derive from God, my friends, as this is diametrically opposed to all that the Lord did in creating Israel, and as our various governments are all involved in this, one surely cannot accept that these receive their authority from God, or that he ordained the system whereby this situation could arise. Now, you may have wondered why I have begun this recording on a theme which should belong to our political Quo Vadis series. But when you look at the current political situation, you cannot escape the reality of its implications. I know that a lot of people say that one should not mix the Bible and politics. This is precisely what the social gospelers are doing, They're using the Bible as the base from which to launch their humanistic, socialistic, one-world ideology. However, when I say we should take a look at the current political situation, I mean that we should look at the real world around us, the real world, and see our particular situation as a tangible vindication of what the Lord our God said would happen if his people refused to abide by his law and operated under some other man-conceived constitution. What is happening specifically within Anglo-Saxondom politically is precisely what the Lord said would happen to his people. This, my friends, is a 20th century vindication of the law word which the Lord spoke some 4,000 years ago to Israel. And while a lot of people say that all this does not interest them because their citizenship is assured in heaven, all that I can say is that this attitude is placing self-interest above the honor and the integrity of the holy name of God. Now, I began this recording by drawing your attention to the general acceptance by our people of the system by which we are governed. The democratic system in which each individual is given to understand that government is by the people and for the people. Notwithstanding the fact that this is a total farce, surely even the most naive must admit that whatever name we may give our system, it is a total failure, and that we should therefore look for something else to govern us, which of course leads us into the subject of this address, namely, who should rule Israel? In the first instance, I would like to draw your attention to Isaiah 45, verses 18 and 19, which read, "For thus saith the Lord, that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I have not spoken in secret in a dark place of the earth. I said not unto the seed of Jacob, Seek ye me in vain. I, the Lord, speak righteousness. I declare things that are right. Now this, of course, is the second witness and amplification of the statement recorded in Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 to 14, and going back a wee bit in Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 and 6. Moses told the children of Israel that the word of the Lord, that which he revealed, was not hidden, that it was not unattainable. It was something that had been made known to Israel, so that the nation could perform its commission by demonstrating in the sight of the nations the blessing that comes from obedience to the word of God. So then, the Lord made his will known to Israel. The sovereign had declared his sovereign will, his constitution in his kingdom, and his subjects were expected to adhere to this. However, as we know, the Lord our God is omniscient. He knows all things, and within this he foreknew that the time would come and a situation arise when Israel would demand a king like the surrounding nations. And while the Lord accepted that this would be so, he ensured that such a king could only act as vice-regent, a vice-regent who in no way had any authority to invalidate the constitution under which the kingdom was to be administered. Now, in this context, that is, when Israel would demand a king, in this context I would like to draw your attention to Deuteronomy 17, and from verse 14, where we read, When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are about me, thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. Now, just interrupting this quotation for a moment, there are 2 points which I feel need clarification. The first being that a rather strange phrase in verse 15. I'm sure you must have noticed it. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee. In the literal translation of the Masoretic text, one finds that it should read, You may certainly appoint a king, which is not a specific command to establish a monarchy as such as we find in the appointment of judges, for instance. It is not a command, but as the text clearly states, it is permitted. You may certainly appoint a king. Now, the second point is, of course, self-explanatory. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. But as many ignore the racial context here, I would like to read the translation from the New English Bible, which says, You shall appoint over you a man of your own race. You must not appoint a foreigner, one who is not of your race. So then, in clarifying these 2 points, we see that the Lord permitted, but did not command, the establishment of a monarchy or government, and although the permission was granted, the choice limited the appointment to the people of the same race. Now, I know that many people do not like to hear the word race mentioned. For some reason or other, it carries the stigma of fascism with it. And to contend that the word is mentioned in the Bible, well, then, people say that's simply heresy. And here, in a modern translation of the Bible, when most people shy away from discussing the subject of race, the New English Bible, with its unquestioned theological bias, is honest enough, in this instance at least, to translate the Hebrew text and to use the word race. You must not appoint a foreigner, one who is not your own race, over you. You see, my friends, it's as simple as that. Now, this qualified permission by the Lord to Israel to appoint one to rule over them would, if the churches spent any time in studying the law, cause many a raised eyebrow, for it positively refutes any suggestion of the universality of man. If all men are equal, and if all have the same universal perception of what is right and what is wrong, why should the Lord God be so unchristian as to insist that, if the people wanted a king, they should be racists and discriminate against all other races by excluding them as nominees for the position of king in Israel? Now, as I've said previously in other recordings in the series, Israel did not question any single facet of the law as this was given to them because, and here's a very good reason, because having been educated by experience, they knew that their national constitution was a safeguard against the repetition of many of their previous experiences. In the context of living under the authority of one who was not of your race, Israel knew something of this when a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph rose up in Egypt and began a century-long oppression of the children of Israel. When Moses told that generation of Israelites who were about to go into Canaan that they had permission to appoint a king, but that this appointment had to be limited to one of their own kind, there was no howl of protest. There was no questioning. There was no argument. The national experience under the authority of others made this restriction very logical, a very logical directive from the Lord. Now, sorry about this rather long digression from our quotation from Deuteronomy 17, but I felt that it was necessary that we should be very clear in our minds about who was qualified in terms of the Lord's directive to govern or to rule Israel. I felt that we had to clarify this point before continuing with the regulations which were applicable to the king or to the ruler. So then, in returning to our quotation and picking up at Deuteronomy 17, verse 16, we read, "But he," that is the king, "he shall not multiply horses unto himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. And it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book, out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes, and to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel." Now, there are several features in these regulations which are applicable to a king or government, which I feel we need to consider here before we continue. In the first instance, we have again a rather strange prohibition, in that the king should not, I quote, "multiply horses unto himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt so that he could multiply horses." Strange, my friends, because, neither Egypt nor Lower Mesopotamia was known as the home of horses, even though the Pharaoh had imported these to draw some of his chariots. However, we do know that the early kings, whether Egyptian, Babylonian, or Canaanite, had horses in direct proportion to the strength of their military establishment, and that the mark of their military strength was the number of their horses. And as this is a historical fact, it would appear to indicate that the prohibition against the king in Israel was that he should not cherish any military ambitions, that he should not aspire to subordinate or influence nations through military conquest. Now, this, of course, don't misunderstand me here, this, of course, has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the defense of one's homeland or the suppression of evil. Military preparedness in this context is fully set out in Numbers 26:2 and in Deuteronomy 20, where national service becomes a national duty. But the king, my friends, is nowhere permitted to involve the nation in wars of aggression to enhance his own political ambitions. So then, the reference to the multiplicity of horses is a direct warning that the king should not use Israel as a military machine. The nation's role, insofar as the other nations were concerned, was that they should be a national witness to the blessings which accrue to those who live under the direction of the Lord. Now, if we pass from this prohibition against multiplying of horses to the prohibition against multiplying wives, plus, of course, the desire for silver and gold, we see the reason for this if we consider the history of Solomon, for it was indeed these things that turned him away from the Lord and caused the division in Israel and its ultimate expulsion from the land of Canaan. In continuing from the negative "he shall not," we see that the regulations passed to the positive, in which it was incumbent upon the king to have the law of the Lord with him at all times. Now in this, we see that while the Lord gave permission for one of Israel's race to sit on his throne as vice-regent, his word, his law, his constitution was to remain as the only instrument by which Israel was to be governed. In the several rabbinical books and works that I have read just recently on this particular subject, all of them, without exception, stress the fact that the king's law was to be an exact replica of that which resided in the Ark of the Covenant, and that in the reproduction of this, special attention was paid to it, so as to make it identical in every way to that which was in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, although we cannot vouch for the letter-for-letter and word-for-word accuracy of our present-day Bible, we see a strange reenactment of Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 and 19, in the coronation of the British monarch. For I'm sure that we'll all recall the words of the Archbishop of Canterbury in presenting the Bible to the new monarch. He said, "We present you with this book, the most valuable thing the world affords. Here is wisdom. This is the royal law. These are the lively or living oracles of God." Strange, isn't it? Why should this Old Testament regulation, which bound the king in Israel to the law, be practiced in Britain? After all, according to theology, the Old Testament has nothing in it for Christians, and the law, well, that was done away with some 2,000 years ago, and with it the regulations which demanded that the monarch should receive and keep the word of God with them. My friends, it's very strange, and I'm sure you must agree, how inconsistent theology and people can be. Now, one last comment now before we pass on, and this is to draw your attention once again to the subject of the Levites, who are involved with the law, and which has absolutely nothing to do with sacrifices and priestly ritual. If you look at the 17th chapter again, this is the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy, look at the first verse, and you'll see that it is totally out of place, in that it deals with sacrifice, whereas the remainder of the 20 verses in that chapter deal with things of a political nature, and in which judgment, usually reserved for civil courts, is very much to the fore. In this, the Levites are seen as the adjudicators because they were the custodians of the Constitution, which set out prescribed penalties for specific crimes. So then, the point to be noted again is that the Levites were not priests in the priestly sense, but rather administrators of the law, as indeed is implied in the Hebrew word Cohen. And as civil servants, they were to be concerned with the implementation of those things which were written in the law. Thus, when the king was required to have an exact replica with him, it was the responsibility of the Levites to ensure that this was so. And significantly, the writing which was delivered to the king had absolutely nothing to do with the Aaronic order, nor the Aaronic ritual. It had to do with the administration of the nation, the divinely given statutes and judgments which the king in his role as chief administrator was duty-bound to enforce. So then, if we look at Deuteronomy 17, we see that the Lord permitted the appointment of a king in Israel to act as vice-regent, a king whose rule was limited to the implementation of the law, which was the expression of the Lord's will for his people. Now, in this provision for a king in Israel, and as we have seen, the Lord positively stipulated that the king should be chosen from among the Israel people, and under no circumstances was a foreigner to be nominated for that position. I find it rather strange that while foreigners are totally excluded from nomination as king, indeed the law precludes aliens from being present in Israel. Now, while this is so, no limitation is placed on any of the tribes in Israel. No limitation is placed on them which excludes the nomination of any of their people from participating in the election of a king. The only insistence in Deuteronomy 17 is that the king or ruler should be an Israelite. If, however, we go back to the time before the law was given at Sinai, we see that in Egypt, and in blessing each of his sons, Jacob bestowed the blessing of royalty on Judah, in which he said, and I quote, "Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be upon the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down. He couched as a lion, and as an old lion. Who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be." This, of course, is recorded in Genesis 49, verses 8 to 10. Just by way of interest, and before we take a look at Judah as the patriarchal base from which the royal line was to come, there appears to be some discrepancy between Jacob's statement concerning Judah's brethren bowing down before him and Joseph's vision recorded in Genesis 37, where all his brethren made obeisance to him. Just read those 2 points again to confirm this point for yourself. Read again Genesis 49, verses 8 and 10, and then pass back to the story of Joseph recorded in Genesis 37, and you will see there that Joseph had a vision, 2 visions in point of fact, one in which the ears of wheat, they were 12 in number, and 11 bowed down to his ear of wheat, and then the second vision was when the sun, moon, and 11 stars made obeisance to him. Just read it again for yourselves, and see that there appears to be some sort of a discrepancy between the two. Now, if we go back to Genesis 29, verse 35, we see that Judah was the 4th son of Jacob, born to him by Leah, who had already produced Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. And apart from the fact that Leah gave her 4th son the name of Judah to perpetuate her praise of the Lord, there appears to be no further light as to why Judah should be selected as the royal line. When we look at the record of the life of Judah, there's certainly nothing in it to commend his offspring as being qualified to provide rulers for Israel. And if we think of his part in the sale of Joseph into Egypt, we see that he was involved with monetary gain, 20 pieces of silver being the price received for his younger brother. Now, Joseph, as I have mentioned a few moments ago, had a vision of the sun, moon, and 11 stars making obeisance to him. And when he had told this vision to his father, Jacob's reply was, "What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brother indeed come and to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth?" And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. Now, if we continue with this story, we see that Joseph's brothers were very antagonistic toward him, and when he joined them in Dothan, there was a conspiracy to kill him. It would appear that Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, who had been rejected by Jacob because he had lain with Bilhah, Leah's handmaid, was not present when the conspiracy to kill him was begun. And when he heard that they intended to kill him, he would not have anything. He would not have any part of it. No blood, he said, was to be spilled. And so he merely suggested that they seize Joseph and put him in a pit in the wilderness. Now, nothing, of course, is said why Reuben made this suggestion, but I feel that it's quite likely that, having lost his place as the firstborn, he may have seen Joseph as the means of reinstating himself with his father. Putting Joseph in a pit would, as far as his brothers were concerned, this would have sealed Joseph's fate. After all, scorpions and serpents were known to frequent dry wells, and after they had left to tell their father the sad news of Joseph's unfortunate death, he, Reuben, could rescue Joseph and return him to Jacob, who would be so grateful at the restoration of the son whom he had deemed dead that he would forget about Reuben's lapse with Bilhah. Now, this, of course, is merely a suggestion. We do not really know why Reuben counseled against putting Joseph to death there and then. However, when we think of Judah's role in this dirty business, we see that he was motivated by profit. For we read in Genesis 37, verse 26, "And Judah said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brethren were content. Just as a later Judas sold Christ for silver, so an earlier Judas sold his brother Joseph for silver. So then, the first picture that we have of Judah does not commend itself as the basis for a royal tribe, a representative of which was not to multiply to himself silver and gold. The next event in the life of Judah which concerns us is, of course, the story of his marriage to the woman of Canaan, a union which had been forbidden to both his father Jacob and his grandfather Isaac. The first two verses of Genesis 38 tell the story, and I feel we should read these. "And it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned into a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hirah. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. And he took her, and went in unto her, and she conceived, and bare a son, and she called his name Now, apart from the fact that Judah's wife is simply called the daughter of a certain Canaanite, we have no biblical means of ascertaining her real name. Indeed, the Bible is totally silent on the subject of the names of the wives of the 12 sons of Jacob, with the exception, of course, of Joseph, who married Asenath, the daughter of the priest of On, and, of course, Tamar, who produced the twins Pharaoh and Zerah to Judah. In the main, the rest are not mentioned. We do not know whom they married. Now, in a work under the title of The Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament, which contains, among other works, the Testament of Judah and the Book of Jubilees, we are not only given the names of the wives of the sons of Jacob, we are told where they came from, and insofar as Judah was concerned, we find that his first wife was referred to and is referred to as Bathshua, which literally means the daughter of Shua, and which is precisely what is told to us in the Bible. However, we find that Bathshua had a personal name, which was Betsuel, and there appears to be no reason to doubt her Canaanitish identity. Now, I mention this because some Israel identity teachers have suggested that the word Canaanites could mean merchant in this instance, which is quite correct. But to identify Shua as a merchant of Adullam rather than a racial Canaanite is twisting words, I believe, to make them conform with some preconceived theory. Bathshua, or Betsuel, bore Judah 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And in the Bible we have the bold statement that Judah, I quote, took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar without providing us with any further information as to her family connections or where she came from. However, in the Testament of Judah, that is again in the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament, in this we find that Judah, being smitten by his conscience for having married a Canaanitish woman, tried to make amends by importing a wife from Padan Aram, the region where his father and grandfather had taken wives from. And in this record we have it that Tamar was descended from Aram, the son of Shem. Now, I know that a lot of people object to using sources outside of the Bible, as indeed I have done on this occasion. But when, through scribal inferences, and I must add Jewish scribal interferences, the record becomes unclear, I think that consulting other sources to find the truth is certainly warranted. Just think for a moment, and this is a point that I would like you to participate in. Just think for a moment and ask yourselves this question. Why was Tamar barren after 2 marriages, yet she conceived after a single encounter with Judah? Why? I would like again to revert to that book, the Testament of Judah, and I'd like to read the story of Tamar. Judah's 3 sons, and finally the marriage to his daughter-in-law are all set out there. We read that Bethuel knew why Judah had imported Tamar for his son and knew that it was an attempt to breed out the Canaanitish strain in his offspring. Now, to prevent the consummation of Tamar's marriage to Bethu kept her son totally intoxicated for 3 days, and whether it was this or some other reason, died before the marriage was consummated. Tamar was then given, of course, to Onan to raise up seed to his elder brother, and although the marriage lasted for a year, again we get back to this Testament of Judah, he tells here that Bethuel succeeded in preventing its consummation, and that when Canaan died, when Onan died, Tamar was still a virgin. At this stage, I'd like to quote from the Testament of Judah, as it picks up the story from this point. It reads, "And I wished to give Shelah also to her, but his mother did not permit it, for she wrought evil against Tamar, because she was not of the daughters of Canaan, as she herself was." In this account there is a break, and it appears that Judah goes back and tells the story of what happened when he married Bethuel. And the quote is again, it's in continuity. "And I knew that the race of the Canaanites was wicked, but the impulse of youth blinded my mind. And when I saw her pouring out wine, owing to the intoxication of wine, I was deceived, and took her, although my father had not counseled it." And then the story goes back to the story of Shelah. "And while I was away, she went and took for Shelah a wife from Canaan. And when I knew what she had done, I cursed her in the anguish of my soul. And she also died through her wickedness, together with her sons." Now, the remainder of the story in the Testament of Judah is identical with that recorded in Genesis 38. And as we know, the twins, Pharez and Zerah, were born to Judah by Tamar. It was after these events in the life of Judah that famine struck the land of Palestine, and Judah rejoined his brethren and went to live in Egypt. Apart from the tribal blessing by the dying Jacob in Egypt, and in which Judah was associated with the scepter, nothing is further heard of this tribe until the allocation of the territories in Canaan. Again, I say, when one looks at this story of Judah and the history of the events in his life, one cannot help but wonder at the reason why this 4th son of Jacob and his offspring should be selected as the royal tribe. Now, from this review of Judah, let us pass to the nation as it took possession of Canaan, remembering, of course, that Joshua had succeeded Moses as the leader in Israel, and that he was no Judahite, but rather a prince of the tribe of Ephraim. As we look at the book of Joshua, which records the events of the invasion of Canaan and the battles for possession, we see a rather grim shadow of things to come, when tribal disobedience to the command of the Lord concerning the Canaanite people became evident, with the tribe of Judah singled out for special mention in this context. They settled down in their tribal allotment, in their territorial allotment rather, with the Jebusites living in their midst. This you will find in Joshua 15, verse 63. In the last chapter in the book of Joshua, we have yet another grim warning of things to come, for Joshua found it necessary to draw the nation's attention to the fact that the Lord had been with them from the beginning, and that it had been his faithfulness which had given them the land which they now possessed. The nation therefore owed him something. Now therefore, fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served, that were on the other side of the flood, and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. From this, and despite Joshua's leadership, it was apparent that the people were already violating the law covenant made at Sinai, and despite their reaffirmation of obedience to Joshua, the Lord our God will we serve, and his voice will we obey. Despite this, one cannot help but feel that Joshua had many misgivings about the future. Now, in passing on to the book of Judges, we run into an area of some confusion, which undoubtedly shows scribal involvement or interference with the text. If you recall, I mentioned the fact that in Joshua 15, verse 63, it is recorded that Judah failed to dislodge the Jebusites and settled down to live with the Jebusites in their midst. Now, if you look at at verse 8 in the first chapter of the book of Judges, you will note that it reads, "Now the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem, and had taken it, and smitten it with the edge of the sword, and set the city on fire." While if we go to verse 21 in that same chapter, we read, "And the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin unto this day." You see that there's obviously some confusion here. But if we pass on to the second chapter in the book of Judges, and my friends, I do trust that you are following all these quotations with a Bible in hand. I think that that's absolutely imperative. If we pass to the second chapter in the book of Judges, we see that from verse 6 in that second chapter, we have a continuity from the last chapter in the book of Joshua. Let me explain. In the 28th verse of Joshua 24, we read, "So Joshua let the people depart, every man unto his inheritance." And if we go to verse 6 in the second chapter of the book of Judges, we read, "And when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man unto his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel." Now, as we pass on, we find three references to a situation which developed in Israel, in which it states that there was no king in Israel, and that every man did that which is right in his own eyes. These references, of course, are found in Judges 17:6, 18:1, and 21, verse 5. Now, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, a critical examination of the record of the book of Judges shows evidence of three hands at work compiling the record: an original account, a later priestly account, and a final and much later attempt to reconcile both the original with the priestly accounts. Well, be that as it may, it appears to be an incontestable fact that at the time that we are dealing with here, there was a situation in Israel when every man did that which is right in his own eyes, when self-interest took precedence over both tribal or national interest. And to prevent total chaos from destroying Israel, the Lord provided the judges. But despite this, it was evident that the time was approaching when the Lord's provision of regulations for kingship in Israel was to be applied. This trend, of course, had already been evident in Gideon's 300, who had routed the Midianites. For, if you turn to Judges 8:22, you read then the men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of the Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Gideon's words were, of course, whispers in the wind, for the people were increasingly anxious to be like the surrounding nations. And even though the judges ruled as kings without being appointed as such, a situation finally arose when the demand was made for a king to just like the surrounding nations had. The record of this, of course, is found in 1 Samuel 8. And it's rather interesting to note what prompted the demand. Just listen to it. And it came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Now, in demanding that Samuel provide a ruler, without asking that he petition the Lord, meant that the elders were demanding the abdication of the Lord, and the abrogation of his right to appoint those who would administer the law in Israel. This, my friends, was not a rejection of the law. The fact that the elders made their demand against the background of Samuel's son's perversion of the law indicates this. It was a demand for a personality who would be visible, who would be viable, and who could be seen, and who could judge them, and they would be just like all the other nations round about them. So it was merely a demand for a king. It wasn't a demand for the abrogation of the law. Now, the Lord's acquiescence to the demands of the people is, of course, recorded in 1 Samuel 8:9, where Samuel is advised to heed the demand, but at the same time, he was instructed to warn the people of the consequences of their acts, and what would happen when a king, such as they wished, would reign over them. Now, as this is precisely what did happen to Israel, and as the situation still obtains today, I'd like to read what the Lord told Samuel to tell the people. And my friends, I would like you to listen very, very intently to this, or better still, follow it in your Bibles. Note it again, the people wanted a king. The Lord had already made provision for a king, and it would appear that even before that the Lord had appointed the royal house of David, that of the tribe of Judah, that this would provide a king. Now, in consequence of the Israel people demanding a king, irrespective of who, this is what would happen to them. This is what the Lord told Samuel to tell the children of Israel who had now demanded a king. This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands, and captains over 50s. And he will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, that is, to be makers of perfume, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the 10th of your seed, and of your vineyards, and give them to his officers and to his servants. He will take your men servants, and your maid servants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take the 10th of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in the day because of your king, which you have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Now, whichever way you may care to look at this form of government, as described here by Samuel, is nothing less than autocracy, where supreme power is vested in the monarch himself without any restraint or limitation. Notwithstanding the fact that the Lord demanded that the king should have his law, the constitution of the kingdom, always at the side of the king, the Lord's description of the consequences of the demand for a king, and this notwithstanding the rule of the house of David of the tribe of Judah, meant a national existence of total subservience to the will of the king, and not subservience to the will of the Lord. The fact that the house of David sat upon the throne of the Lord as vice-regents in no way alters the consequences of demanding a king, and even though, as promised by the Lord, we still have the throne of David with us, we are experiencing in one way or another precisely what the Lord, through Samuel, said would happen. There is the throne of David in the midst today. There is a monarchy which can be traced historically right back to those early times. But has this made us any better? Has this brought us any nearer to the time of true liberty? My friends, when you look at the Anglo-Celto-Saxon people, the modern Israel people in their very different component parts, whether you find them in America, whether you find them in South Africa, Australia, or New Zealand, we are all under a tyranny of government. We are under the tyranny of men who pass legislation, who change constitutions, who impose their will upon the people. We are living through exactly the same description as was found there in 1 Samuel 8. We are living under this tyranny. We are paying all to the governments. We are now giving our all to the governments. Instead of the government being the servant of the people, the government is now the master of the people. We are the slaves. You see, this is what has happened when our Israel people demanded a king to be like the surrounding nations. We are paying for it now. The Lord said we would pay for it, and we certainly are paying for it. So then, let us go back and have a look at that question once again. Who should rule in Israel? My friends, a lot of people would say the house of David should rule in Israel. My friends, God should rule in Israel. For only under God and the implementation of his will there be true peace and perfect peace for his people Israel. That is the only thing. It is only he who should rule in Israel. Never mind the house of David. There have been some pretty bad kings in the house of David. All right, they have preserved the concept of a monarchy. They have preserved the institution of the monarchy. But is it said today that this is the throne of the Lord? No one tells you about that. No. There's too much glory in the monarchy, not in the fact that this is merely the throne of the Lord and those occupying it are vice-regents. That is all it is. But we today need to have God as king in Israel. And now, shall I tell you something? We're going to have him, whether we want it or not. We're going to have his law as our constitution. And you know the time is coming. We have his assurance. The Lord himself does not allow his word to return unto him void. He said that it would prosper in the thing whereunto he sent it. And he has promised that the word, in the person of his Son, our Lord, Jesus Christ, is coming again. And he is going to take that throne. And he is going to put that law into operation. And you know something? I'll tell you something that is going to happen. We are going to know a peace like we have never known before. We are going to experience a peace as we have never known before. We are going to know a liberty that we have never known before. This is promised by our Lord, my friends. So all we can say now is, Lord, come quickly.